They deported him forever. 6 months later, he was running the biggest mob meeting in history with Frank Sinatra as entertainment. February 9, 1946, New York Harbor. Lucky Luciano stood on the deck of the SS Laura Keene, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into the distance. He was 50 years old, dressed in an expensive suit, surrounded by reporters and federal agents, being forcibly removed from the only country he'd ever called home. The deal was final: deportation to Italy in exchange for his wartime service helping the Navy protect the docks. He would never set foot in America again. His empire was over. His influence was finished. The greatest gangster in American history was being sent into permanent exile. The U.S. government believed they'd solved the Lucky Luciano problem. They were catastrophically wrong. By December 1946, Luciano would be sitting in a Havana hotel suite, hosting every major mob boss in America, coordinating a criminal empire that spanned continents, while Frank Sinatra sang in the background. The man they'd banned from America had simply moved his headquarters 90 miles offshore and continued running organized crime as if the deportation had never happened. It was the ultimate power move, and it drove the FBI absolutely insane. But the real story was never only about defying the deportation. To understand what happened in Cuba, you need to understand what deportation meant to Lucky Luciano. He'd come to America from Sicily as a 9-year-old boy in 1906. He'd grown up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He built his empire in New York, survived 50 stab wounds on a Staten Island beach, created the commission that modernized organized crime, and even helped the United States win World War II. America was his home in every way that mattered except the legal paperwork. Being sent back to Italy wasn't just exile, it was erasure. The Italian government didn't want him either. He was an American gangster with no real connections to modern Italy. He'd left Sicily as a child and never looked back. Now both countries were rejecting him, treating him like contraband being shipped between ports that didn't want to accept delivery. But Luciano had spent his entire criminal career turning disadvantages into opportunities, and he was about to prove that power doesn't require geography. It requires relationships, money, and vision, all of which he still possessed in abundance. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. Luciano spent only a few months in Italy before he started planning his next move. His lawyer and closest associates visited regularly, bringing messages from the commission, maintaining his connection to the American underworld he'd built. And one visitor brought an intriguing proposal. Mayor Lansky, his oldest friend and criminal partner, had been developing casino and hotel operations in Havana, Cuba. The Cuban government was friendly to American investment, including the illegal kind. And Cuba was close, tantalizingly close, to the United States, 90 miles from Florida, a short flight or boat ride from Miami, close enough to maintain control of his American operations while technically being outside U.S. jurisdiction. Lansky's pitch was simple: come to Cuba, run things from there. The Cubans will take our money and leave us alone. The Americans can't touch you because you're in a sovereign nation, and you'll be close enough to Miami and New York to keep running the empire. It was perfect. It was audacious. And in October 1946, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship headed for Havana. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. Imagine the nerve required to make that move. You've been deported with explicit instructions never to return to the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. government has made it clear you're finished. Every law enforcement agency in America would celebrate your permanent exile, and you respond by sailing to an island 90 miles from Florida and setting up headquarters like nothing changed. That's not just breaking rules, that's psychological warfare. That's telling the most powerful government on earth that they don't get to decide where you operate or when you're done. Luciano arrived in Havana and immediately began rebuilding. Mayor Lansky had laid the groundwork perfectly. The Batista government was cooperative, more than cooperative, enthusiastically welcoming. Luciano checked into the Hotel National, one of Havana's most luxurious properties, and began receiving visitors. Not tourists, not legitimate businessmen, mob bosses from New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, all flying to Cuba to meet with the man the U.S. government thought they'd neutralized. Within weeks, Havana had become the de facto headquarters of American organized crime, and Luciano wasn't hiding. He was operating openly, eating at the best restaurants, gambling in the casinos, conducting business like a legitimate executive. The Cuban authorities knew exactly who he was and didn't care. The money flowing into their economy was too good. Luciano wanted to make a statement, something that would announce to both the underworld and the U.S. government that his deportation had changed nothing. He decided to call a conference, the biggest gathering of American mob bosses since Atlantic City in 1929, and he was going to do it in style, the Havana Conference, December 1946. Every major crime family sending representation to Cuba for a week of meetings, parties, and business coordination. But there was something no one around him could fully understand. The Havana Conference wasn't just about business. It was about power and symbolism. Luciano was proving that he could still summon the most powerful criminals in America to a meeting, even from exile, that his words still carried weight. That the commission he'd created still functioned with him at its center, regardless of where. Geography placed him. The invitations went out through secure channels. Vito Genovese came from New York representing Luciano's old family. Frank Costello attended, the smooth-talking political fixer who'd helped build connections with legitimate power structures. Albert Anastasia, the brutal enforcer known as the Lord High Executioner. Joe Bonanno from New York, Santo Trafficante Jr. from Tampa, representatives from Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans. Even smaller operations sent delegates, and Mayor Lansky, of course, was there as co-host, the financial genius who'd made the Cuban operation possible. But the star attraction, the detail that made the Havana Conference legendary, was the entertainment. Frank Sinatra performed. The biggest celebrity in America at the time, at the peak of his career, flew to Havana and sang. For a room full of gangsters, officially, he was there for a vacation and some nightclub performances. Unofficially, everyone knew whose party he was attending. The image of Frank Sinatra crooning while Lucky Luciano and the American mafia conducted business became one of the most iconic intersections of celebrity and organized crime in history. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The meetings themselves covered familiar territory, coordination of illegal gambling operations, narcotics distribution networks that were becoming increasingly important as Prohibition's end had forced diversification, labor racketeering, and dispute resolution between families. But the real purpose was demonstrating continuity, showing that Luciano was still the central figure in American organized crime despite his deportation. And it worked. For several months, Havana functioned as organized crime's capital. Luciano lived openly, conducted business freely, and enjoyed the Cuban sunshine while technically being in exile. The setup was perfect. He was outside U.S. jurisdiction, inside a cooperative government's protection, and close enough to maintain control of his American operations. But perfect setups rarely last, because while Luciano was operating openly in Cuba, the FBI was watching. And they were not happy. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The U.S. government discovered Luciano's presence in Cuba relatively quickly. Federal agents monitoring mob activity noticed the unusual travel patterns, major crime figures all flying to Havana around the same time. Informants reported that Luciano was living openly in Cuba. The FBI began pressuring the State Department to do something about it. The problem was legal jurisdiction. Luciano was in Cuba legally, welcomed by the Cuban government. The United States couldn't arrest him there. They couldn't force his extradition because he hadn't committed any crimes on Cuban soil. All they could do was apply pressure to the Cuban government to deport him. And that's exactly what they did. The U.S. government made it clear to Cuba that harboring America's most notorious gangster would have consequences. They threatened to cut off legal drug shipments Cuba needed for its hospitals, a move that would have been catastrophic for Cuban health care. They applied diplomatic pressure through multiple channels. They made it impossible for the Batista government to ignore the issue. Cuba had to choose between Lucky Luciano's money and America's cooperation. It wasn't a difficult choice. In February 1947, just over a year after arriving in Havana, Luciano was informed that Cuba could no longer host him. He was being deported, again, this time back to Italy with explicit warnings that he would not be welcome anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The island kingdom lasted less than a year, but in that time Luciano had proven his point. Geography didn't define power, relationships did. And even from exile, he remained the most influential figure in American organized crime. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. Luciano returned to Italy and spent the rest of his life in Naples and Rome. He maintained connections to American organized crime, consulted on major decisions, and watched from across an ocean as the empire he'd built continued to evolve. But he never returned to the Americas, never set foot in Cuba again, never saw New York except in memories and photographs. The Havana period became a legend within the legend. The time Lucky Luciano defied the U.S. government and ran organized crime from a Caribbean island paradise. The conference where Frank Sinatra sang for the mob. The moment when deportation couldn't stop the most powerful gangster in America. But there's a deeper truth beneath the glamorous surface. The Cuba experiment demonstrated both Luciano's incredible resilience and the ultimate limits of his power. He could operate from exile. He could maintain influence across continents. He could coordinate criminal enterprises without being physically present. But he couldn't overcome the combined pressure of the U.S. government when they decided he was truly unacceptable. Havana Conference was Luciano's last hurrah on his own terms. After February 1947, he was truly exiled, truly isolated, truly removed from the American underworld he'd spent his life building. He remained influential, respected, consulted, but he was no longer at the center of power. He was a voice from across the ocean, a legend living in memory, a former king watching his kingdom from permanent exile. Many knew the legend. The gangster who defied deportation, the exile who ran a mob conference from Cuba, the man who had Frank Sinatra as his entertainment, but very few understood the hunger that built it, the immigrant kid who refused to accept that America could reject him, the crime boss who wouldn't let borders define his influence, the strategic mind that turned every limitation into an opportunity. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper, from understanding that power is ultimately about relationships and perception, not geography or official status. That being exiled doesn't mean being finished if you maintain the connections that matter. That sometimes the most powerful response to rejection is proving you don't need acceptance to maintain influence. The real story was never only about what happened in Havana, it was about what it represented. The last grasp at American soil, even if only 90 miles offshore. The refusal to accept exile quietly, the insistence on remaining relevant even when the world's most powerful government wanted you gone. Luciano died in 1962 at Naples Airport, 16 years after the Havana Conference, still in exile, still connected, but forever separated from the country he considered home. His body was returned to New York for burial, the only way he could permanently return to America. Thousands attended his funeral. The commission sent representatives, and the story of the exile king who briefly ruled from Cuba passed into mythology. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. When historians analyze the Havana period, they often focus on the audacity, the glamour, the celebrity connection. Frank Sinatra singing for gangsters makes great copy. But the more interesting story is what it reveals about power in the modern world. Luciano demonstrated that influence could transcend borders, that criminal organizations could operate internationally with the same sophistication as legitimate corporations, that being physically removed from your power base didn't necessarily end your power. These lessons weren't lost on organized crime, the international coordination that Luciano pioneered from Havana became standard practice. Drug trafficking networks that span continents, money laundering operations that use multiple countries' banking systems, criminal enterprises that operate across borders specifically to evade any single nation's jurisdiction. All of these modern organized crime features have roots in what Luciano demonstrated in Cuba. He proved that exile doesn't mean elimination, that deportation is an inconvenience, not an endpoint. That modern criminals could operate globally just like modern businesses. The U.S. government eventually forced him out of Cuba, but they couldn't undo what he demonstrated, that organized crime had evolved beyond the reach of any single nation's law enforcement. The Havana Conference was both a triumph and a warning, a triumph for Luciano, showing he could still summon America's criminal elite despite his exile, a warning to law enforcement that their traditional tools, arrest, prosecution, deportation, weren't sufficient to dismantle sophisticated international criminal organizations. And perhaps most importantly, it was personal. Lucky Luciano spent his entire life building power, creating structures, demanding respect. Being deported was the ultimate disrespect, the ultimate rejection. The Havana period was his way of saying no. No, you don't get to end my story. No, I don't accept your verdict. No, I'm not done. For 10 months, he won that argument. He ran organized crime from Cuban soil, hosted the biggest mob conference since Atlantic City, lived openly and luxuriously while technically being in exile. It was a middle finger to the U.S. government that had deported him, delivered with style and strategic brilliance, but ultimately the government had the last word. They forced Cuba to expel him. They ensured he would never return to the Western Hemisphere. They relegated him to permanent exile in Italy, watching from across an ocean as the empire he built continued without him at its physical center. The question is whether that matters. Luciano's physical presence in Italy didn't end his influence. The commission continued to function. His strategic vision continued to guide organized crime's evolution. His reputation and relationships maintained his relevance until his death. In a very real sense, the deportations, both from America and from Cuba, changed where he lived but not who he was or what he'd built. And that might be the most important lesson of the Havana period. Power isn't only about location, it's about what you create. Who respects you, what you represent? Lucky Luciano created modern organized crime. No government could deport that creation. They could only move the man. So when we remember Lucky Luciano in Havana hosting mob bosses while Frank Sinatra sang, living in luxury 90 miles from the country that exiled him, we should remember both the triumph and the tragedy. The triumph of refusing to accept defeat, the tragedy of being permanently separated from home. The power of creating something that outlasts your physical presence, and the limits of that power when governments decide you're unacceptable. The island kingdom lasted less than a year, but its legend lasted forever, and Lucky Luciano proved one final time that the most dangerous gangster in America wasn't the most violent. It was the one smart enough to turn exile into opportunity, deportation into defiance, and every ending into a new beginning, until finally there were no more new beginnings, just Naples and memory and a legend that refused to die even when the man finally did.